Hello there. What if I told you that I can tell if any game will be fun within minutes, if not seconds of playing and looking at it? And you can do this too, as long as you know what to look for. This isn't a superpower and anyone can do it. And I'm going to show you how training yourself in this technique will allow you to become a better consumer and designer of games. What I want to teach you is a mental checklist of specific things to look for, inspired by Josh Bice's blog post on Gamasutra. While you may naturally end up picking up on a few of these things when you play games already, when we are aware of what to intentionally look for, we can be much more powerful and precise with our opinions on games and design. If you like this and game design in general, consider subscribing and liking this video as it really helps out the channel. And with that out of the way, let's move on to the first thing to look for. So the very first thing to look for, whether you're designing your own game or looking to buy a new one, is the playability of the game. Now, what does this mean? Playability tries to look at the ease of use for the game. This involves things like the UI, the GUI, and generally whether you can make sense of what's happening on your screen. At this stage, you want to take particular care to look at the game's controls and interface. Is it comfortable to use, and are the gameplay elements responding how you expect them to? For example, Fall Guys has a jump input bug that prevents the player from jumping when running over specific edges of the terrain. This is incredibly frustrating when it does happen occasionally. Another example of playability could be the size of the buttons that the player is having to press regularly. If the buttons are too small and require an unreasonable amount of precision to click, it can lead to misclicks and unintentional actions from the player. While these can seem minor at first, it's the UI that the player has to interact with all the time while they're playing the game. So even minor gripes and irritations can build up to really frustrating things after the hours we're expected to play any games for. Good playability will mean that the controls, the inputs, the interactions, screen transitions, loading screens, physics engine, collision system are all working cleanly and comfortably. The next thing you have to look at very closely is the core gameplay loop. This is the main thing you do in the game over and over again. A game can be fantastic from a playability point of view, but can be lacking in its core gameplay loop. If this is too simple or not balanced properly, players will struggle to engage with the game, because the thing you're asking them to do over and over again just isn't right. An example of this would be most one-tap mobile games. Alright guys, today we're going to play another generic tapping game with overly aggressive ads. Gameplay. And an ad already. Wow. Amazing. There is a flip side to this too. Many games can have a great core gameplay loop, but lack that playability factor. Strategy games can often suffer from this problem because they are incredibly complex to learn and understand, but can become extremely rewarding once you know what's going on and you've adjusted to the thousands of buttons and UI in the game. So it's really important to try and find and understand this core gameplay loop. In fact, I remember when Death Stranding was announced, everyone was really confused by the gameplay footage. People just weren't sure what it was you actually did in the game. And I think that this is because all you could see in the trailers was just a bunch of traveling. No one suspected that the traveling itself would be the core gameplay loop, because that idea hadn't really been explored like that before. The final thing you need to look for ties in very closely to the core gameplay loop, and this tends to go unnoticed quite often by reviewers and first impressions. This is because the final thing you have to look at is called the long run. The long run is where you try to predict where the game will logically and reasonably end up after playing it for a while. Will this game still be fun after X number of hours of playing it? Now, trying to forecast and predict where a game is going to go may sound ridiculous, but generally once the core gameplay loop is established for the player, it shouldn't really change for the rest of the game. The challenge provided to the player will generally increase in complexity and scale, but the loop stays the same. A quick example would be indie game classic Super Meat Boy. The core gameplay loop is simply to jump or wall jump around all the different obstacles in the game to reach the end of each level. This sentence is basically true at every single point in the game. And this is fun enough, but what is it that's going to keep it interesting for the duration of the 10 or so hours you're meant to be playing the game? Well, even after just playing one level, we can see that the game is incrementally adding new challenges and obstacles for the player to beat. And as long as this keeps happening, the game will stay interesting. Another example would be RPG games that usually offer quite a simple core gameplay loop. Over the course of the long run, RPGs generally only evolve in the form of bigger attacks and bigger stats. There's often not that much variation in the actual challenge presented to you. To combat this, the RPGs generally lean into the progression and story elements to try and keep you invested in the game. If a core gameplay loop starts to get boring and repetitive, then the game probably lasts longer than the loop can reasonably support. Short, refined games that don't outstay their welcome are generally better than longer games that pad out their content and dilute the core gameplay loop. We are going to quickfire through a few examples of using this technique, but to quickly recap, if we specifically look at the playability, the core gameplay loop, and then how it holds out in the long run, we can generally come to a pretty good assessment of how good a game is. As you practice this more, your analysis skills for your own projects and other games will get better and better. And it's as simple as that. Fall Guys. The playability is generally pretty good. The GUI is simple and clean overall, and the challenges presented to the player are generally pretty easy to understand. The jump bug is kind of annoying but happens pretty infrequently. The game is very chaotic in nature, but thankfully doesn't require too much crazy precision from the player's part. The core gameplay loop. Run, jump, and grab your way through each challenge, trying to qualify or win each round. The long run. The long run is kind of interesting because it has changed since Fall Guys was initially released. Learning any of the stages after playing the game for long enough can make the challenges become repetitive and just trivial. Like I said, this was a really big problem on release and was probably one of the reasons why the game fell hard. Guys, oh god. They have tried to address this more recently by adding random variations to all the stages to try and reduce this repetitive, trivial nature of just learning the game. Next example, Pokemon, a childhood favourite of mine. Clear and very simple UI. It has very obvious menu options that allow you to navigate combat pretty effectively. However, all the animations and transitions can sometimes feel quite slow, which can be really annoying when you're expected to repeatedly fight enemies or grind XP through various points of the game. You can turn a lot of these animations off in the settings, but then the game just doesn't look as good. The core gameplay loop is very simple. You catch and train Pokemon with specific strengths and weaknesses and use them to fight stronger and stronger enemies. The long run is okay in Pokemon, but it's not the best. If you're not interested in the competitive side of the game, then the main things to keep you going are the exploration of new areas, beating the gyms and the Elite Four, as well as the general collectathon where you have to catch them all. And a lot of these things can end up being quite boring after you do it for 6 games in a row. And for one quick final example, SuperHot. It's probably one of the most playable games I have ever seen, to be honest. Almost nothing in the game gets in the way when you're trying to play. The core gameplay loop is very easy to understand. You move around and shoot enemies, which is pretty basic, but the game also has a very intuitive time freeze mechanic that is integral to the combat. The long run here is a really good example of a game not outstaying its welcome. Each of the levels tries to add something new and remix the challenge in different and interesting ways. The game isn't too long, and so the gameplay feels really interesting right until the very end. So yeah, I often find myself trying to perform this analysis on my own games I'm making, and it often highlights issues if I can't easily sum things up or I have major playability issues. It's a pretty useful tool, and hopefully now you'll be able to use it as well. Please subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed this. It really is the best way you can support this channel. Follow me on Twitter for random and sporadic updates on my current projects, and join the Discord to get feedback from and talk to other like-minded devs. And until next time, goodbye.